Welcome to But Her Lyrics, the show where we delve into the meaning and politics behind the songs of War on Women and other artists you love. I'm Shawna Potter, singer and lyricist for War on Women, and your host. This is the official start of Season 2 of BHL, and I'm getting weird by starting with a topic that should absolutely be a wow song, but for whatever reason, just isn't yet. I'll be chatting with Adryan Corcione, a self-described freelance drug journalist, about an article they wrote at the end of 2021 titled How the Criminalization of Testosterone Attacks Gender Variant People. They wrote it for Filter Mag, which is an online harm reduction magazine. Now, before we dig in, this episode is sponsored by First Defense Krav Maga. Hello to Nick and the whole team there. And also Women's Pride NFT, a project that my badass patron Stefan is involved in. Also, a huge shout out to recruit Melissa P. for her support. Thanks, Melissa. So, I'd like to think my band is full of trans accomplices, you know? Our song Second Wave Goodbye is basically about trans rights and will be featured in an upcoming podcast episode. I spent a lot of my early activism working with local trans communities. We currently have a gender nonconforming person in the band, but I have not found a way to write a song that is specifically about the struggles of trans men and other people using testosterone that has seemed appropriate. As we venture into this new season together, where I will be taking deep dives on War on Women songs, other people's songs, and even topics that could and should be War on Women songs, I want to get something clear up front right now. No one has to write a song about anything. And no one can write songs about everything, right? You can care about an issue and just not find the inspiration you need to put pen to pad, or even just not find the right way to sing about it, especially if it's something that you have no personal experience with, right? So that alone, the fact that I have not written a song about tea being a controlled substance and its effects on the trans community, that by itself is not a problem. But interestingly, it does feed into a common problem that trans men and trans masculine people have, which is that of erasure. The first time I heard directly about the erasure of trans men, I was doing a training on how to respond to street harassment. It was at a Trans Day of Remembrance event, maybe 10 years ago. And I remember this trans guy said, now that I present as male, I no longer get catcalled. But instead, I find that when I'm in public spaces, I am completely ignored, like I don't exist. That was super sad to hear that. And it's such a perfect example of how harassment is different for everyone. Like there are so many people I know, like me, that wish we were left alone and ignored in public, right? But to be acknowledged as a human being that exists, it's crucial. It's something everyone deserves. Now, I will not pretend to know all the reasons why the erasure of trans men is a thing, and who knows if I'll ever write a song about it, but I am hoping that my upcoming interview with Adryan will make visible one of the issues that many trans men and others face today. Interview time! Adryan Corcione, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Please introduce yourself to everyone.
Thanks for having me on, Shawna. I'm a freelance drug journalist. I am also a PIC abolitionist. So this is a great example of what we're going to talk today about the overlap of abolition and drug journalism, particularly in how it impacts transgender, non-binary, intersex, and other gender variant people.
Yeah. I mean, yes, you are the right person for this talk, obviously. But you're, I just want to say, I looked at your website. You're also a speaker. You've written for every major awesome outlet, and you're a photographer.
Yes.
And what I love about your photography page is that it's just live music and protests, which is exactly perfect for But Her Lyrics. So everyone go to Adryan's website and check them out. They're wonderful photos. So my band saw a tweet of yours in our timeline sharing an article that you wrote for Filter magazine. And it's called The Criminalization of Testosterone Attacks Gender Variant People. And you mentioned wanting to do some interviews about it. I don't know if you had this one in mind coming on a punk rock podcast, but I thought this would be a perfect topic for BHL to dig into deeper because this absolutely should be a War on Women song. Can you sum up the core issue here? What are we talking about?
Yes, absolutely. So what we're talking about here, we're talking about gender affirming hormone replacement therapy. We're talking about people who use testosterone. So this could be transgender men who are looking for the masculinization effects of it, non-binary people who are looking for more androgynous features, intersex people who may have like medical reasoning for it, or they might also engage in this for gender affirming purposes,
Mm-hmm.
because there are cisgender men who take testosterone for purely medical reasons. So that's kind of the overlap of HRT. However, from what we know about anabolic steroid abuse and how the government tends to use prohibitionist drug policing to target drug abuse, which we all know doesn't work, but I digress. We're still here. uh, yeah, and there was just a few different pieces of legislation that criminalize testosterone as a controlled substance under the Controlled Substance Act, um, enforced by the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA. And this has decades of history. So in 1990, there was the first criminalization of Metabolic Steroids Act. It was sponsored by Democrat Bill Hughes, who was hits close to home because that is Bill Hughes represented the constituency where I grew up, and that even my high school had a whole like theater where I used to perform music in when I was a teenager. Yeah, and then Joe Biden was part of the 2004 kind of advancement of all of this. But these measures were targeting cisgender men who are in athletics to, curb their use of kind of performance enhancers. And since we live in a trans antagonistic society already, those people weren't necessarily considered when this was being criminalized. So this is kind of like collateral damage of all of that. And I think there is like a larger issue that is happening here about how about the competition and capitalist nature of professional sports, and also body dysmorphia not being limited to gender nonconforming people by any means, and how it is even really hurtful for cis people, and it hurts everybody.
So this is just a case of this thing that's been law for a while, right? Preventing performance enhancing drugs. And then the bureaucracy just not catching up with the fact that people use testosterone for different reasons.
Right.
I can't imagine what it must be like for people who are trans or gender nonconforming to access healthcare. I have a hard time with healthcare, right? And I'm white and cis, and like obviously it's harder for everyone else. Can you give us examples of what trans and gender nonconforming folks have to go through for basic healthcare to even get testosterone if that's what they need?
So to access gender affirming care, it depends on your state, because there could be barriers. So in some states, you may need to see a therapist for 6 months or a period of time.
6 months.
Yeah, so a mental health professional can decide whether to believe you that you are the gender that you say you are.
And that's probably someone assigned to you, right? Like that's not even necessarily your chosen therapist.
Right. I mean, well, it can. I guess it depends of what is chosen, right? Because not all therapists have the power to do this, right? So if somebody has a relationship with the type of therapist that they maybe have been talking about these things, if that person doesn't have the credentials to, because these are letters that you would take to go to a clinic to get these things, to say, oh, I've gone and done this thing. And similarly, that letter, needing a letter to kind of explain this thing, that is what is needed for like surgery. So in either to go to a surgeon, you need some sort of certification by somebody, a medical professional who specializes in gender affirming care, to be like, this person is definitely this gender, and also they are seeking this type of surgery. And also insurance plays a part in this, right? Because it deems what is medically necessary,
right?
Because that can also be used to deny people the care that is medically necessary and a care that they deserve. So yeah, so there's lots of bureaucratic stuff going on before somebody can even step into the office to get their testosterone, because it can be such a long process. There's something called the model of informed consent, which is a more progressive and like favorable measure where you don't have to go to a therapist. You can just walk into a Planned Parenthood that has been offering HRT for a handful of years now, where you can walk in, I'm transgender, I'm non-binary, I would like to go on gender affirming hormone therapy. They'll be like, okay, we believe you, here, sit. It'll probably take a lot of waiting. But when I did it, I went in and said, I want this thing. And then I was able to walk out with a prescription. So it is possible. Yeah. But I also lived in Philadelphia at the time. So it's definitely not everywhere like it should be.
Now, when I was reading your article, PDMP came up. What is that? Tell us about that.
Yes, it's a prescription drug monitoring program. And that is essentially like a database that medical professional and law enforcement can access of everybody who is on a controlled substance. So this could be testosterone, this could be Adderall, anything that is prescribed by a doctor that falls under the Controlled Substance Act and it's scheduled in some way.
That seems weird, right? For cops to be able to access your medical records?
Yes, it's definitely weird.
Okay, just
definitely
sure.
Weird. Right, because like hypothetically, you could see the police have access to what people are taking, and we don't know how that can be used, right? And then you have really awkward situations. So like in my article, for instance, there's another filter contributor, ML, and they went to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist was able to access this information. So that person was outed really without before even approaching that and having the autonomy to choose whether or not they were going to do it. And yeah, like that happened to me at a dentist one time. So I was just like, it's not really relevant for my dentist to know that, because when I go throughout the world, it's sure, I would like my dentist to gender me correctly, but sometimes I'm just in and out there, and I would rather just get in and out if I have a cleaning that's only a half hour, right?
Yeah, what does a teeth cleaning have to do with?
Right. So you have awkward situations like that, and obviously this is like a system set up for people to be harassed, for people to endure more violence, because it's just it's a dangerous game to play.
Does this contribute to the ways in which trans men experience erasure? Do you feel comfortable speaking to that at all?
Sure. I guess I can speak from my experience as a non-binary person who's on testosterone. And I think like the common thread here is more encompassing for transgender folks, and like particularly like with this theme of athletics and testosterone, of what we see right now with these bills all over the country that are banning transgender girls and women from competing on the team that is most affirming to their gender, because of this biological essentialism, or, to sum that term up, of just men are men, women are women. You're biologically determined by whatever sex or gender you were assigned at birth. But what we know about gender is that these things are not true. Your gender is not fixed. It can change over time. And, a transgender woman's testosterone levels absolutely do not make her more enhanced, and it's not cheating. And also it brings, and like personally, I'm curious about this, especially for transgender men who are athletes, where it's like a lot of this is targeting trans women because of what we know about trans misogyny.
Yes.
But I'm always like, well, what about transgender men who are on testosterone? Because that is totally like left out. And I think from like a trans exclusionary radical feminist point of view, of course, they don't see transgender men as actual men.
Right.
But like hypothetically, what would that look like if someone who is assigned female at birth is taking testosterone? That's not seen as cheating as much as a transgender woman. So it's like kind of unique in how trans feminine people face those like added oppressions on top of each other. But yeah, it just gets into really seedy territory where we're making a lot of assumptions about testosterone that gives it a lot more credit than actually it is, to be honest.
Right. And like
Because,
me, I'm like, let's not do that. I'm
yeah,
not into giving testosterone more credit than it deserves. But
right.
that's the killjoy feminist in me, probably.
Yes, absolutely. There is a great book. I forget the author, but it's Testosterone, a history that came out. I think this came out in 2020. It is all about the history of testosterone and kind of like undergoes this social history of like, we have all of these assumptions about testosterone makes people violent and angry and yada, 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 all these things that are really just like biological essentialism and just giving it way more credit than it actually gets, because it's a hormone, and also cis women do have testosterone too.
So, how does this issue of the criminalization of testosterone, how does that fit in with the general erosion of trans rights these days? Aren't things getting? I feel like things are getting worse for trans people right now. Like more laws are being enacted that limit their rights. How does this fit in?
Yeah, I'm thinking of that anti-LGBT bill in Florida about schools, because there's like definitely an overlap with schools being particularly trans antagonistic, and just education systems, and overall anti-LGBT. When you have any controlled substance, so if there's people listening to it who've ever been prescribed a stimulant, there are these similar barriers of like you can only there's only a certain amount that can be prescribed to you. You need to keep going and seeing a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
So like unlike per se a diabetes medication that is not a controlled substance, you can get away with not going to a doctor for years because of GoodRx and something like that. However, to get an
Mm-hmm.
Adderall prescription, to get a testosterone prescription alike, it's like you only have an X amount that you can use up. So you need to keep on going back to the doctor. If you're uninsured, that gets more and more expensive, just for somebody to say, hey, yes, this is still medically necessary for you to have, as opposed to anything else, right?
Right. And getting to the doctor, affording to go to the doctor, having a doctor that affirms the gender you are, that's already a hurdle. And so to be forced to keep going back is just another.
Yeah, and especially in rural areas that don't have access to like these like gender like LGBT care clinics, are very few and far between.
So is there anything about this issue that you feel doesn't get talked about enough, or something that you wish I asked you about the criminalization of testosterone?
With what kind of inspired this article is that I had personal experience of hostility from the pharmacy, them just like not really understanding, like particularly with needles. I'm always arguing with the pharmacy about which needles I need, because testosterone is a very thick substance, so you need a different needle to inject than one to draw.
Yeah.
But usually they give you the same needles, but once I posted on Twitter and had a call for sources, there were so many people were like, yes, like this, like criminalization affects me in such a unique way,
Hmm.
and so differently. So there were shared experiences, but particularly the source that I interviewed at the beginnings, San Francisco, is a non-binary person who is traveling to back to New Mexico from visiting their parents in Connecticut, and they were in a small town in Texas, and then this kind of whole incident went down, and they're just pulling over just to take a break, and a police officer knocks on their window, and then it kind of escalates into this searching their car. They find the syringes, start mistaking them for like an injectable drug user, which of course would not be deserving of that too. Because drug policing is terrible for everybody, even if you are somebody who uses drugs. But when the testosterone came into the picture, they did not have good intentions of how this was acquired. It didn't really matter that it was their prescription. It didn't matter that their name was on it, right?
Right.
So yeah, and it kind of escalated to just being in jail for at least a night, maybe two.
All because they had a prescription with their name on it in their car.
Yeah, something that was legally prescribed to them, and they were in the cell with heroin users too. So I think it is kind of like what injectable drug users face, a particular kind of stigma amongst people who use drugs,
Mm-hmm.
and how criminalization and stigma go hand in hand And I think like because this kind of took like this connection between what I do as a drug journalist, but also carrying over into my personal experience and gender. And it really calls for how health is policed. Certain people's health are policed, certain people's health are criminalized, and drug laws need to be abolished. DEA, abolish the DEA. The Controlled Substance Act doesn't do anything to actually curb addiction. What we know about addiction and how to treat it, syringe exchanges, harm reduction measures, overdose prevention centers, these are things that actually save people's lives and keep people alive and provide them access to a social support net, shall they want to access these services. And I think for any LGBT person, especially trans people, it would be really awesome reimagining a future where they can access gender affirming care in the same place where they get their needles. I know at my doctor, even though I'm prescribed syringes, I don't have a place to safely dispose of them there.
That's wild.
Yeah, so I think it's just a lot of these existing harm reduction measures that we know to be true for the general people who use drugs should absolutely be included. And we need more social support for LGBT people, for trans people, for non-binary people who need this education of also how to use their syringes, because particularly with testosterone, it's a very long needle. It hurts.
Ooh, yeah.
It's not fun. Yeah, and like there's lots of comprehensive drug education that a lot of people need, that the in-person support is really a lifeline too for people who it could be life or death, whether they get access to hormones or not, and other types of gender affirming care.
Other than supporting harm reduction efforts in your town, what is something that cisgender allies can do to help, or really anyone, can do to help around this issue?
Yeah, because a lot of this goes back to like opposing this kind of like community policing and drug war mentality. That yes, we absolutely have people whose lives and their families are torn apart by incarceration. Which is from more the abolitionist side. I'm very much into prison letter writing and creating connections with people behind bars. But particularly with drugs, it's also this part of like this interpersonal work of like, how are we policing each other? How are we carrying these stigmas like that is kind of fed to us from capitalism, fed to us from police? How are we using these things against each other? Like I'm thinking of just like at work, just drug testing, like the fact that we still have that, especially in places where weed is legal now.
I know.
Doing drug testing for THC is like pretty arbitrary.
Ridiculous.
But even other types of drug testing just beyond THC are pretty arbitrary and used as like a legal way for people to be denied employment. Similarly to like so-called criminal records are used to deny people employment. This is the legacy that the drug war has. So even tearing down a part of like, oh, well, does my workplace have this thing? Have this drug placing? Do we deny people who have so-called criminal records and kind of dismiss them? Like these are issues that can hit somebody, whatever proximity to power you have in your workplace. And even like if you are in just your own family, amongst your chosen family, and friends, it's like, how are we talking about people who use drugs? I don't even want to say the C word, but like, crackhead should be treated as a slur. As it is. Like these should not be, like we shouldn't be saying that in a just flippant way.
Yeah.
And really challenging our own biases towards people who use drugs, I think is really important and part of the work too, because that also falls under anti-racism work. It falls under all of this social justice to make spaces safer, like in your book.
For sure. Wow. Thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find you? Where can people read your work? What do you want to promote?
So people can follow me on social media, twitter.com/mixthem, MXTHEMME. It's also on Instagram. Don't use Instagram as much, but also Filter Magazine. So shout out to everyone who I interviewed for Filter. And thanks to Castelli and Will, the editors there. that are always supportive, so supportive of my work. And yeah, so I think, and also on Facebook also mix them, and Instagram mix them, but Twitter is probably the best place to find me. And if you would just want to learn more about all of the work I've done, adryancorcione.com is a great place to start.
Cool. I'll put the links in the show transcription for sure. Adryan, thank you so much for spending your morning with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Shawna. It was really great.
Thanks again to Adryan for spending some time with me, and stay tuned for a bonus rant session where we complain about Joe Biden and his administration's quick reversal of what was to be a historic investment in community-led harm reduction efforts, all because some Republicans complained about it. Now, I'm not sure if it's going to go on YouTube or if it will be a Patreon exclusive just yet. I'm still figuring out season 2, but to be safe, follow me on socials and join my Patreon. I just revamped all my benefit tiers, so if you were holding out before, I get it, but right now, you just might find something you like, so check it out. Patreon.com/Shawna Potter. Well, that's it for now, but keep listening for a quick ask at the end, and just know that you can support this podcast by sharing, subscribing, and reviewing it. It's free and it helps. To find the transcripts or to find out more about what I do, like my book, my trainings, my Patreon, head to shawnapotter.com. And to learn about all things War on Women, head to Linktree, linktree.ee/War on Women. Now, here's my ask. If this episode inspires you to write a song about testosterone being a controlled substance, or all the unreasonable hoops that trans and gender nonconforming folks have to go through just for basic healthcare, let me know. I want to hear it. Or if you know of a song that already exists, please tell me, share it with me, and I'll share it with everyone else. Okay? Till next time.